Hi, Henrik. Thank you so much for your time today to talk about the beginnings of audiovisual translation theory and the beginnings of ESIST. You are one of the first authors to write about subtitling and audiovisual translation, both regarding research results and theoretical concepts of audiovisual translations and translation and how it could enrich translation studies theory.
Hmm.
This was at the time, mid-late 90s, when there was very little on the subject. We had Iverson and Carroll's book on subtitling in 98, Candace Whitman's book Through the Dubbing Glass in 92, and most publications a researcher could find back then were either on the endless dubbing versus subtitling debate or on the technicalities of subtitling, how it is done. It was mostly referred to as subordinate or constrained translation, etc. Could you tell us a bit about your first steps and how you became interested in subtitling practice, theory, and research?
Yeah, it started with me being an English student at the University of Copenhagen. And I had a teacher who was very interested in different types of translation. So that inspired me to actually apply for the position of a freelance translator with Danmarks Radio, at that time the only TV channel, state monopoly, you might say. Very good, high quality material. So I started out as a subtitler at the age of 27. That was in 1980. Okay. And based on
Wow.
my experience as a subtitler, I went back to the university and wrote an MA thesis on everything that's worth knowing about subtitling in theory, in practice, internationally, and so forth. And that was based on, among other things, my first article in 1980. You said 1998 was early. No, 1988 is early. This is the first. This is my contribution from. I mean, it's a sort of a collected work, right? My contribution from the first Scandinavian conference on screen translation that is actually subtitling. Okay, so I wrote this MA thesis, and I resubmitted it in a edited and expanded version as a prize thesis. Got a gold medal at the University of Copenhagen in 1991.
Wow.
Was immediately hired as I mean, it took me 11 and a half years to study because I did all the, these wonderful things in the meantime, living in a commune, having two kids, blah, 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 you know, and then I ended up working at the university. I've been there ever since. By the way, I'm going to retire next year. But so I started this, and with this colleague, well, who was a teacher, he became my colleague, Kai Dollarov. Maybe you know the guy.
Of course.
Yeah,
I remember
right.
the of the
And a lot
first
of the viewers
articles
will
I
know him
read
too.
was from him. Yes.
Yes. Um, and he and I and other people organized a number of conferences in Elsinore, uh, the first one of which was the first time internationally that anybody came up with screen translation as a subject. So we had sort of a subtopic. I remember I had a 4 hours spent in one of the evenings presenting my super high-tech PC-based
Okay.
subtitling machine, because I was still working as a subtitler, but being employed at the university made it impossible to keep up, with both jobs at the same time.
So it was screen translation at the time.
Screen translation, also
The
because it's a direct translation of the Danish billedmedieoversättelse,
hmm
literally picture media translation.
So that was the term that was used
Yeah, and it's
back
still
then.
used. You can
Still
find a
used.
lot
It's still
of
used.
material on this. I originally didn't like the audiovisual translation term, because audiovisual to me, and in Danish, by the way, was used a lot about totally different types of, I mean, overhead projectors kind of
Oh, okay.
slides. That was audiovisual because you had somebody talking, and you saw something in the meantime, or you had these kind of hippie like shows, light shows with stuff, and and the Doors music, etc. That was very much
Oh,
of the
okay.
connotations of audiovisual. So I never really liked, but and I recognize that today most people talk about AVT. Okay, no big deal. But as you said, I took it into, I, I, I sort of branched my research into two directions. One being the semiotic side of things. And as pretty recently as in 2017, I published an article or contribution to one of the major Routledge handbooks of translation on the semiotics of translation using all the so-called AVT related phenomena as a, a stepping stone to this total, I think I have 34 types of translation, of which, for example, literary translation and dubbing is even the same. It's just the same. And that was one direction. And the other direction, by the way, is my realization that with this very, very lopsided exchange of things internationally, with Anglophone programs being, so dominant worldwide, what happens is very often that you get a lot of Anglicisms transferred into the different national languages. And especially with what I call a conlocative type of translation, where conlocative because you see the original at the same time as you read the translation, as it were, right? So that means that a lot of, and that goes for dubbing as well for other reasons, means a lot of structures and a lot of linguistic features at all levels are being transferred. So this research for the last 20 years ended up in this book here, which is a good old-fashioned Habilitationsschrift, sort of a Dr. Disputates in Danish. I'm going to defend it this autumn on October 29th. If anybody's interested, they're very welcome at the University of Copenhagen. But that's sort of the other branch. So I'm not presently, since 2018, I haven't actually written any new articles on screen translation, because for me this has been a very fascinating other branch of research.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many young and talented people who write about subtitling, other types of screen translation,
Indeed.
with cognitive angles and what have you. I mean, it's impressive.
It is indeed. Back then, were you involved in the beginnings of ESIST in any way when ESIST was founded?
Yeah, I was involved at the very first meeting in Wales, the meeting that sort of founded ESIST,
With
but I haven't been very
Hewlin
active since.
James.
Yes, she was the first coordinator, and I remember the official details about the ESIST. It was all based on her address in Wales, as I think.
Uh-huh.
Bandy.
Anything you remember from that meeting? Who else was there? What did you talk about the need to have an association?
No, it was not a very exciting meeting. It was very much about practical details,
Mm-hmm.
about how to base such an organization. How could you do it in a
Mm-hmm.
sort of a non-profit organization? Should it be linked to any kind of EU legislation? It was pretty boring. We didn't do it much about the stuff that ABT
Is
is
about.
based on. It was
Mm-hmm.
not really there as far as I remember, but it was necessary. And then just like a lot of formalities is the way I remember it, I must admit.
Well, a lot of board meetings are still the same.
Yeah, board meetings are sometimes
but
board meetings.
indeed, but we do get to do exciting things like interviewing people who know a lot about the history of audiovisual translation theory. So what kind of activities were you involved in the different international venues and fora? Did you do any joint international projects back
Not
then?
originally, because in the first years I was just on my own in Denmark, right?
Mm.
And then I attended all the Berlin conferences for about 10 years. That would be 5 or 6 conferences. So what happened was naturally that as the whole, let's say, sub-discipline or discipline grew, people were increasingly, active. Young people came, like Jan Pedersen in Stockholm, for example. He wanted me as a PhD supervisor, and I agreed. And he was an exciting and very cool guy to work with. And we had great fun stealing theoretical concepts and typologies from one another regarding, for example, the more or less famous ECR phenomena that he sort of invented, the extra linguistic cultural references that we have to deal with. And of course, his dissertation dealt with a comparison between Danish and Swedish subtitling practices in terms of how often, for example, would a professional subtitler resort to a strategy of substitution. Where is the credibility? Is it going to be funny in Danish, or is it going to be true to the original if you cannot be funny in the same way with the same kind of wordplay? That would be Torsten Schröter, who was also one of the PhD students involved. Or was it sort of the extra linguistic phenomena that made Jan famous as his specialty, right? but sadly, I've been the only almost the only researcher into AVT in Denmark. But certainly in a few years, all the people from the countries that didn't know much about subtitling suddenly became the top researchers, which was funny, because, I mean, in Scandinavia, we always consider the dubbing countries as sort of somewhat backward in terms of subtitling, and even the Anglophone countries with the 3 lines and 16 CPS, totally terrible types of subtitling where people cannot enjoy the film at the same time if they have to, read all the time like this. So we still have these debates in the professional subtitling environment in Scandinavia, that we don't want these American 14, 15, 16 CPS rates.
Or 17 even.
Yes.
Yeah. And having to spend all the time reading instead of, and actually deterring people from watching subtitled material because they don't want to read. So, and if,
right.
And when you get this practice where you have more and more stuff to read and less time to look at the screen, the more terrible it seems, and the more deterred you are to watch something like that. So it's a vicious circle, right?
Yeah.
By the way, you also wrote the entry on subtitling in the first edition of the Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies.
That's right.
In the section about the future, where you wrote about what it is, what subtitling is, and how it's done, etc., it was back in the 90s, so not much was written about it. There were articles here and there from the 60s even about subtitling, but when I said before, the first book on subtitling was only in 98. So in the section you wrote about the future of subtitling, where you wrote very interesting things. If you look at them now, you can see some of the things that you predicted. You wrote about pivot subtitling, naming it, quote, less desirable practice, and hoping it would not be further adopted. And it is the norm now. It is the basic way subtitling is done for non-English material. So given that templates and pivot subtitling through English are the reality of most subtitling workflows nowadays, what are your views about these practices?
First of all, I'd like to correct you here, because it's not the norm in Scandinavia anyway. We have subtitlers who can subtitle directly from a lot of languages. So it's still seen as a second-rate type of subtitling. It's not just me and my sort of academic.
Sorry, I was talking about a more international, big industry
Okay.
workflow.
Yeah, I know it happens, and it has happened in Scandinavia, especially in the with the commercial channels, to save money, basically. And things that are done to save money are usually not good. Uh, so, but to be more academic and more exact about it, uh, I always teach my students. I've taught this since 1991 at the Copenhagen University with professional subtitling equipment. And my experience is just from my own work and from teaching all these people is that if you do not get the original sound, if you cannot understand like an interpreter what is said and the context in which it's said, and you cannot reconstruct it, redesign it, reinvent it in your own language or whatever language you're subtitling into, you shouldn't do the job. So point one, don't use scripts. Use your ears. If you're not good enough, find someone else. Okay, that's the ideal. If you work with scripts, it should be scripts from the original language and then you translate into your own language. Why? And that's your question. Because if you work with a pivot or relay language, for example, let's say Dutch, English, Danish, or Lithuanian, Spanish, Greek, or whatever it is, just like in the EU, of course, the subtitler or dubber, whatever, does not know the original language and has no way of checking whether this relay interim version is any good. So that's one thing. There's no check of the value of the translation.
The quality of the template. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second thing that is that you can transfer phenomena that are okay in the relay language into your own language. And I have a terrible example, a very good example of a terrible phenomenon or a terrible case of this. In I think it was 1990 already, I was contacted by Hilverda, a Dutch scholar or MA thesis writer. I mean, do you know this? Perhaps. Okay, it was the Danish film, The Celebration by Vinterberg, who just won an Oscar now for Another Round. Okay, so his first major movie was from 1988, Festen, translated into The Celebration. Hilverda was a student or a researcher in the Netherlands. And as you may know, and many of our viewers may know, Danish and Dutch are very close, closer than Danish and English or English and Dutch. It's like a triangle, right? But they hadn't anybody who could translate directly or subtitle from Danish into Dutch, apparently. So they just bought the English translation. And the whole point of this film is that the young person present at his rich father's 60th anniversary points at him or the parents, you can't see that, and accuses him, we know, as Danes, because it says du, right? You, singular, of abuse, when he was a kid, right? So this guy was a pedophile, apparently. Whereas the English translation, of course, just says you. And the Dutch translator got it as jullie. I think that's the Dutch term for plural, you. But it's not the two. It's not the people present or even the parents. It was the one person, the man, his father, right? So that's just a very simple phenomenon that you, if you translate via a language with a much narrower, range of nuances or of verbal ways of communicating things, you tend to get lost.
Yeah, I mean, it happens every day, also with formality.
So that's why I'm saying that pivot translation is a very bad idea.
Yeah. It happens also with formality when you translate from a language with different formality levels, like German or Spanish or French, into a language with different formality levels, like Greek, and then you do this through a language that doesn't. So
Yep.
So
It's
how do
very
you do
much
that?
about.
Unless it is well annotated, unless the person who has done a very high quality template like that explains everything in the annotations. It is a way to do that. But you also wrote about personalization of subtitles
Yes.
in that entry. That is using different sets of subtitles for for the same film or program to suit the needs of various user groups. This was a very innovative idea back then, and there weren't. It wasn't easy to implement technically, only through teletext, because people couldn't choose
Right.
the kind of subtitle they wanted. Now with streaming platforms, you can do that. So these ideas are very, very valid now. But even though streaming technologies have made it technically easier to implement, it still isn't. We haven't seen yet all the different sets of subtitling being available to viewers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in any case, what do you think has changed over the years in the technical part of translation, and what kind of questions you think still remain unanswered?
I mean, sadly, it's a very bad way of saving money because you could make an international exchange. I wrote about it in 1992. I wrote about it again in 2018 in another Routledge handbook of language politics in translation. And it would be great to have an exchange. Let's say that in the EU, just to start with that, we could have of major Anglophone and other programs, of course, we could have sort of a bank of subtitles, right? So that let's say we have Greek people in Denmark who enjoy, let's say, a French or American program, a film, episode, whatever, and they could just switch on the Greek subtitles because the Greek subtitles are already there somewhere, right? We could have neighboring countries being represented. In this case, we could have German, Polish, Swedish, Norwegian. We could have a version for slow readers. We could have a version for people who want the original version instead of the translation, etc., etc. I mean, major immigrant communities would benefit greatly, and Denmark, in our case, would benefit greatly if we had a lot of less integrated people, not any longer relying on Turkish television stations, for example, for entertainment, but they could just get Turkish subtitles on Danish programming, including Anglophone films, for example.
Yeah, you
That
can
would be
actually
great.
do that. You can do that. You can do different languages. You can choose
Yeah.
different languages
But
in
but
Netflix.
that's not happening because
But
it will cost a little bit of money. But very often you could reuse the cues for a film and just insert, almost like with pivot translation, you could just insert let's say French subtitles or Swedish subtitles. And of
it
course
already
if you
happens.
want it,
But the thing is that Netflix has this option. But the
yeah,
thing is
I
that
know.
it also it because they want to not clutter your user experience with too many with making available all the sets of subtitles for all the languages. They give you only the 2 or 3 in the neighboring countries, but there are ways to see all the available subtitles, like 20 or 25. But the thing is that you only get to have the different language versions, not the different um, kinds of subtitles for slow readers or
Right, right.
verbatim if you want, etc. Um, how has audiovisual translation evolved over the years? How would you describe research on professional interlingual subtitling from the beginning until now? The data empirical studies are based on traditions of professional subtitling, language pairs. You told us a bit about that, but it would be nice to hear more about your views.
Yeah, I mean it's been a major development partly to do with the development in let's say, translation studies proper, that have, in a certain way, we see the whole discipline as being more scientific, you might say, more empirically based, or even experimental with just a method like eye tracking, for example. I remember the first time I talked to an eye tracking scholar back in 1991 in Belgium. And I sort of accused him of being a behaviorist, and he refused adamantly. But I still think it's a methodology that cannot stand alone, because what you see is really just the way the pupils react in the eyes of the beholder, literally. We don't really know the cognitive processes that take place. So there's sort of a black box kind of problem methodically.
Was it
But
the
that was
research? Was it the research that the characters per second idea was based on?
no, the characters per second idea is really just based on very loose a very loose piece of research once done in Sweden, as far as I remember, Hansson, something in the 1970s. And I think it's very much just a rule of thumb. I mean, I haven't really seen very convincing material. It has been done, especially with interlingual subtitling, of course, and there's a lot of research being done and been earlier done in terms of how to, for example, teach English to Spanish kids in the U.S., Spanish-speaking young people in the U.S. So the whole interlingual branch of subtitling has been investigated earlier than the interlingual branch, I think. But but it's fair enough. I mean, Diedewalle was the researcher I talked about before in Belgium, who was very early out. But some of his method, I mean, it was terrible, because some of these subtitles were made by non-professionals, so they looked awful and they were not in sync. Some other researchers even let people actually sort of cue them themselves, and then they checked the rhythm. Some of the of this research didn't even have a realistic audio visual film running at the same time, and it was very primitive in those days. I think it's improved a lot.
But the articles we have read about that, then you mean these early articles by Diedewalle were based on, the research was based on material that was not up to par. That's
well, the material. I mean, those people, Diedewalle and his assistants. I'm not going to be, particularly nasty to Diedewalle, because he was a pioneer. But a lot of it was made by people who were not professional subtitlers, and they were not, let's say, academically trained translation scholars either. So they were sort of, he was a psychologist, for example.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Behavioral psychologist, more or less. Anyway, but that was a great start. And later on, a lot of people, including my Danish colleague Christian Velblom, has been doing work on not just the reception of subtitles or dubbing, for that matter, but also the production, using these eye tracking studies to monitor how actually professional translators work. But again, it's a black box phenomenon. You have to follow it up, but with qualitative interviews. What happened there? When I can see you used 30-second pause to do something. What happened? What were you thinking? Did you look anything up? Blah, 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 That's just one thing. What interests me very much is let's say, the more, on the one hand, the more linguistic aspects. What kind of strategies are used? Why some countries more liable, for example, to use adaptation strategies? Others would be more, let's say, source-based. So that the translations would be not very functional, but very formally equivalent. That's one thing, for example. And then we have the whole technical issues about how should they look, segmentation, which I've been doing a lot of, to teach my students anyway, reader-friendly segmentation practice. We have talked about the exposure rate. But a totally different branch, which I don't really know whether has gained weight now, is the, let's say, the social linguistic or sociological one. For example, how many Germans have voluntarily uh, opted for the subtitles on DVDs since 1999 or whatever? In terms of Netflix and other types of media, how many people actually use the different types of audiovisual translation? Is there still this kind of idea that it's the more, especially in the south of Europe and other places in the world, is it the more sort of intellectual choice to go for subtitling, or has it become very popular among, let's say, people with no theoretical background, which is the case in Scandinavia, of course. Everybody reads subtitles. People don't think about it. And everybody believes that dubbing looks awful because it's out of sync by definition, unless it's interlingual dubbing, like, for example, Meryl Streep, who's an expert in dubbing herself. Very often, of course, when you produce a major movie, you don't have the sound from the location. You add the sound in post-production, which the Italians have been doing all the time, right? And some actors are very good at that, but I think has not been treated very much in
It's an
in
exception. Yeah, yeah. There was
yeah,
a
it is an
series
exception,
actually.
but it happens very much. There's a lot of post production
Yeah,
even in films that are not supposed to be dubbed because everything is in the original language.
yeah.
But I'm not absolutely sure, because there is so much research into AVT now. And as I said before, my major line of research now for almost 20 years has been the effects of English on languages worldwide. So I may have missed something. I mean, there's an amazing lot of young, talented people who do this, which is absolutely fine. So you know more about it than I do, I think.
Yeah. So, what do you think about the advances in machine translation and the use of it in? Well, you just said that you're not really much involved in it, but as an idea, do you think it might be a useful tool for subtitlers?
I mean, the examples I've seen and the people I've talked to and the the articles I have read on this are not very promising, I think. And as far as machine translation goes, the most likely victim, or whatever you might call it, would be still texts that are language for specific purposes, technical texts, right? And as most subtitles, 99% of subtitles represent direct speech, and very often spontaneous speech. So I think, but again, I'm as we say in Danish, I'm on thin ice here, because there may be some revolutionary approaches from last year I haven't read about or heard about, but the latest thing I've seen on this was still not very convincing.
Mm-hmm.
Quite apart from the fact that I would hate a lot of my former colleagues to be out of work, but that's not relevant in a scientific
Mm-hmm.
context. Have you seen any really promising machine subtitles?
Yes, I
You
have.
have?
I have
Where?
actually. It's I have seen the integration in subtitling tools like Subtitle Next or Una,
Okay.
where you have machine translation systems, for example, by AppTech. They have you can upload your template there, and you can get, as a subtitler, you can use it as a tool. You can get the machine translation result, and it's an article that is going to be it's actually more like a blog post that is going to be published
Mhm,
soon
mhm.
at the
Yeah.
ATA Deep Focus magazine, where I saw that I could use a very high number, an unexpectedly high number of subtitles
Okay.
suggested by the
Okay.
machine translation tool. Most of them were quite simple, straightforward things like greetings,
Yeah.
saying
Right.
yes or saying
That's.
no, of course.
Mhm, mhm.
And then you have also other places where omission was correctly implemented. I mean, the parts that were omitted in order to have a more condensed subtitle were correct. And that was also very surprising. Line breaks were also good. Um, so yes, it is the advances are quite surprising. But of course, there are problems with that. But this is not my interview; it's your
Okay,
interview.
but
So
it still takes two things. First of all, you need to have a written template, right? Because you
yes,
cannot make
and you
the
have
this
very
machine
high,
work from.
yeah, very high
Yeah.
quality template. Yes.
So usually I've always subtitled directly from my ears, right,
Mm,
with no script. Also, it paid me more money, so I could provide for my family,
yeah.
right? It
Yeah.
was great fun. I hate faulty manuscripts, and I'd like to know exactly what's going on. Listen and listen and listen, right? So that's one thing. You need to have somebody type almost down the post,
Absolutely.
the genuine post-production
Yes.
lines, right? So you could avoid that if you just, do the subtitles immediately. And
Hmm.
secondly, you do have to have a very thorough post-editing phase as well, right?
Absolutely. And by as an experienced subtitler, because there are many pitfalls, as I was about
Yeah,
to start
right,
to say, and
right.
I interrupted myself, is that you need to have a lot of experience about what a good subtitle looks like, because you can very easily be influenced by the results, which are most of the cases literal translations, of course.
Okay.
And you don't want that. In the beginning of your career, you always tend to translate literally, and then bit by bit, you learn how to make more fluent subtitles. And this, if you don't already have the skills of writing dialogue fluently,
Mhm.
uh, as um, as you would say it in your own language, then if you don't have this experience already, then it's very easy to fall in traps from
Mhm.
machine translation. I can see a big danger there, but as a tool for an experienced subtitler, I see it as a very promising tool to speed up productivity. Uh, but in any case, despite all the huge technological advances, subtitling as an experience from the viewer's perspective, how we look at subtitles, has remained almost unchanged for the last 80 years. We still have two
Yeah.
lines at the bottom center of the screen. Do you think subtitling will evolve in the future? There will be different ways of presenting subtitling. What are the major challenges facing audiovisual translation now?
I think things only change if there is an outspoken need, and if viewers want it, claim it. And of course, for decades already, you've had uh, various TV channels and various countries using, interesting alternative fonts, for example, different types of making subtitles a more intricate part of the whole visual image, right? Certain films have used this subtitle suddenly turning into blood, for example, in a thriller or what. And if you look at Chinese subtitling, which I know a little bit about, they always operate with not just a fan subbing, by the way, but that's renowned for its annotations, but even
Yeah, the
official or
Danmu.
semi-official Chinese subtitles sometimes involve types of annotations, or you have subtitles down this way, vertical, and then you have your horizontal subtitles. And a line of research that we may start opening at our university is with the Chinese PhD student, is the fact that we have in Chinese, it seems from research, I don't read any Chinese, unfortunately, but I've been told by Chinese people that the average Chinese person is able to read and understand and enjoy more information per second than the average European,
Mm-hmm.
simply because of the scripture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means that the whole discussion about condensation as a necessity, which I've always, in my definition of subtitling, not included, because if people speak slowly enough or if readers are fast enough, there is no need of condensation beyond what happens in the diagonal between spoken language language 1 and written language 2, or even written language 1, because 5 to 10% of what people say in a spontaneous discourse would not look good um, in print, right, or on the screen, because people sound like idiots if you transfer directly what people say, including false starts and hesitations and various types of oral phenomena that we accept with the ears, we don't accept it with the eyes. So back to the Chinese, that would be a very interesting line of research. I hope some of the people who listen to this would pick it up. I mean, is it so that in China you don't have to operate with condensation as a phenomenon in subtitling because people can read more, and these little Chinese characters take up very little space according to the information content in each of them, right? That would be
Without having
nice.
a great cognitive load, you mean that the cognitive
Yes.
load
Yeah, that's
is
right.
not that
That's right. Of
great.
course, you have to somehow measure that as well. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. That's very, very fascinating and a good question for researchers if they haven't
Yeah.
taken that up already.
So it should be not ESIST, it should be W world
It
studies,
is a bit,
whatever.
it is becoming a bit
Yeah, I
already
know, I
is
know.
expanding, which is quite exciting. We see it as a
A new
place
name is needed then.
where academics and professionals and can meet and exchange experiences. So, Henrik Gottlieb, thank you so much for this interview. It has been exciting, very informative,
Thank
and
you.
I hope we have inspired our listeners to our viewers. Thank you so much again, and
Thank you.
speak to you soon.
Yeah,
Bye bye.
okay.